It's an Italian gas station.
Japanese mountain in the background.
Now into the 10th year of Potato Wolf, 1990. Approaching from space. Approaching from space towards the new body state, centered in Italy. Earthquake-proof, with fantastic structures through which we pass to the headquarters, filled with animals below, of the new space state in Italy, after Italy won the World War. It is 1990. Here at 1990, we are reviewing how it is indeed that the United States and the USSR declined as world powers and became second-rate entities. The world today, behind us in 1964, when the US and USSR were at their supreme peak of power, is, of course, now past tense. And we are witnessing a new order, an Italian order.
Throughout history, countries come and go. Wars affected their coming and going and their border changes. Wars became increasingly intolerable. This is not a moral judgment, but a biological one. Warfare between the major powers, involving nuclear and chemical weapons, meant death, not only to the loser, but also to the winner. We had reached such a state of technological development that warfare on Earth meant suicide. If the demise of the USA and the USSR would have been conducted with their forms of military technology, life on Earth would have ended. We had also reached such a state of technological development that much industrial and agricultural activity on Earth would have, in the long run, meant suicide. Due to this mammoth devastation of the environment in the early 80s, the politics of food became the central issue of most every government. The task with industrial and agricultural activity was to advance its technology to forms compatible with nature and with human life. The task with military activity, or the readjustment of borders, was also to advance its technology to forms compatible with the environment. The imperialist nations, the USA and the USSR, did not recognize these obvious solutions. They have continued their policies of trying to build the economy with military expenditure, of marketing unusable items. Their aggressive and arrogant attitudes have forced the rest of the world to ignore and isolate them. Necessity has outweighed egomania. Imperialism was a result of the depletion of resources on sections of the planet, making control over the sections necessary. The industrial powers of the West developed their powers because they were depleting the biological, then the mineralogical resources of their home sites, and they needed to deplete the same resources elsewhere to keep functioning. Their industrial and food-gathering technology depleted raw stocks and diminished the biological powers of renewal. Basically, imperialism was a result of a technology that eventually dead ends. To vilify pronounced imperialists was a waste. They were only doing their best with their technology. Consequently, the imperialists and their depletive, extractive technologies were superseded by developing technologies which maintained the circulation of biological resources and of biological species throughout any coherent water system and then throughout the planet. The imperialists were defeated simply through the use of superior alternatives in the rest of the world. Here, political adjustment was achieved by realizing that the means of production reached by the early 80s had to be changed. By that time, they were environmentally devastating and so had to become obsolete. Coal, oil and nuclear energy, food and fibre production such as animal farming, monoculture, cash crops, use of fertilisers and normal irrigation, and settlement construction that interfered with animal and water movements all ceased. The solution was simple: body states as opposed to empire states. The balance of nature was restored in the form of planet monitoring and management for stable nutrient circulation. So there are now high numbers of wild animals and plants, a continuous exchange of gases, particularly within saltwater catchments or ocean basins, including land supplying fresh waters, soil, and possible pollutants. With the use of sea rigs, waste conversion, marsh construction, and video monitoring as means of production, the Earth's environment is once more cyclic, functional, and life-sustaining. Armed forces and weapons are also fulfilling the purpose of ecological maintenance, except in the USA and the USSR. These two nuclear superpowers have been hit from all sides. but never from the side at which they have their weapons directed.
They were hit from the air. They were hit from space satellites that were monitoring the Earth, and they showed, in fact, an Earth that was irrespective of nations, irrespective of empires, that could subsist on its own only if it were managed as, indeed, the water planet that it is. So Italy took the initiative because Italy had an initiative already in the space program by using ideas from various recent advances in visual thinking. And they said, okay, we are going to monitor the Earth consistently and very rapidly with film. And we're going to then monitor Italy. And we will divide up Italy according to the way it flows into the sea. And we will have all of Italy become, in fact, an engine for producing methane gas, for producing energy, for producing fuel, for producing fiber in the offshore situation. So they divided up Italy, and then they found all of a sudden that Italy had to expand. And Italy had to expand into areas that were previously held by, say, Yugoslavia or Albania. And it made sense for Italy not so much to expand, but to consolidate with those other countries in a new kind of order. They reasoned really quite plainly in terms of the Mediterranean. And they said, well, okay, the Mediterranean, as we see here in the eastward shot of it, has waters flowing in and around Italy, and then now back out through the Straits of Gibraltar, with some activity up in the Black Sea. This whole Mediterranean system is the system that keeps Italy alive, the system that keeps all those peoples around the area alive. And they knew that their life, in fact, their whole energy system depended on that because they had no coal, no stable oil, no subsisting nuclear resources. They could not rely on the imperial states of the USA or the USSR. Italy's policies very rapidly began to be adopted by Europe and caused this organization of the map of Europe, again, along the bodies of water, so that not only would there be a Mediterranean order, but there would be a North Sea order and the Caspian Sea order. To give an example, the Mediterranean in one fell swoop. Then the North Sea system, including the Baltic, in one fell swoop. Then the Russian system coming down the Caspian, and the Mediterranean would expand, include the Black Sea. As we see the Black Sea here, the Mediterranean Black Sea, all in one large unit of production and ecological management. This meant, of course, a continued breakdown of the empires that were remaining at the beginning of the century, and they were destroyed as the World War I and then World War II developed. Italy did indeed win the World War. Italy won World War III, in effect, by breaking down the empires that were persisting until the World Wars. The first empire, and really the most important empire to be broken down, was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire had its end ultimately in the division of Turkey. And Turkey just broke up into the Mediterranean system down here, the Black Sea system up through there, and then part of it into the Saudi Arabian area. This led to a policy for all the Mideast. The Mideast had nothing else to rely on besides oil, nothing else to rely on, say, the way of the coal or uranium. So the Mideast had to reorganize its affairs, and the Mideast, led by Italy, began to do so. As I'll just outline on this map briefly, we had, of course, the Mediterranean system. Then we had a Black Sea system joining up with the Mediterranean. We had a Red Sea system, and we had the Arab Sea system. Activity already in 1979 and 80 in the Iran-Iraq conflict was leading to a beginning of a consolidation of the Arab Sea system or Arab Gulf system, and that was seconded by a Red Sea consolidation, and all of this was backed up by Italian State Oil Company technology and by Italian air monitoring. We now have a report on another aspect of the world affairs that was occurring in Japan. Japan, too, wanted to find an energy alternative. It could not rely on American coal. It could not rely on Middle Eastern oil, which was depleting. It saw that the Middle East was beginning to change its tactics, and the evolution of a new Japanese policy, which was eventually to be based in methane gas available in that area, was, first of all, to take possession of the oil resources of its immediate area. We have a report now from the Japanese correspondent here on what did occur in the North Pacific.
The first measure Japan will take upon accession of the territory of Alaska will be to move the international data line to the Canadian border. In this area, Monday will be Monday in Alaska as well as in the Japanese islands. thus creating a unified time zone within the Federation. Using our advanced technology and superior manpower management methods, not to mention greatly increased manpower itself with recent negotiations with China, we intend to increase oil production by 300% over the next 25 years, thereby freeing us from Mideast gangsterism. We intend to establish an underwater pipeline across the Bering Sea from Nome to another Siberia, continuing on land to Cape Ropatka, where it is a short trip by sea to the various refineries along the Kuril Islands. The existing Alaska pipeline will be closed, until which time a satisfactory trade agreement can be reached with the U.S. Much of Japan's fishing industry and our entire whaling industry will be relocated to the Alaskan territory, including St. Lawrence Island, Kodiak Island, and the Aleutians. Questions of military and strategic nature will be handled at a press conference for that purpose, to be held at a later date. Again, we would like to underscore our delight in the reunification of the Japanese people and our ancestral brothers, the Alaskan Indians.
The means of change in Japan were very much like those of the means of change in the Mideast, and they were all universally adopted by persons in North Europe, South Europe, and in Japan and East Asia. There was a general kind of understanding between these three areas of the world, which had no oil resources and no coal resources for any longer subsistence, an understanding that they could share ideas on how to gain new wealth. And they used military technology. They started with a way of making the eco-bomb. The eco-bomb was something they got out of their cities, and this before you is a vision of the plant that makes this eco-bomb. It made the eco-bomb by converting all the waste into some kind of hydrocarbons and then making microorganisms from that waste, as we see a transformation of the waste to feathers, and from feathers into silicate compounds in the marshes. And there we have a desert scene in the Sahara, for example. Italy was instrumental in changing the Sahara, just as Japan was instrumental in helping to aid in the development of, say, Australia, so that it would cease to be desert and would become green grassland. Here we have a desert situation, and we begin to blast it. This is all done by the new army, which is an ecological army using the eco-bomb. And it builds up these marsh structures, drops on the starfish, and spreads the eco-feathers. And the birds come feed on it, and it gives off wafts of smoke or evapotranspiration, showing life in its splendor. The marshes develop, they grow green, they spread like fungi. The water is up well from below, they spread too, and we begin to have an expansion, and eventually animals. Wild animals edible for human beings, so plentiful that we can subsist on them and drop the whole domestication of animals that led to the deserts in the first place. There we see the marsh from the air. There we see the marsh with the new kind of satellite monitoring. And there we see the marsh from the air again. And this is the technique, the secret weapon, the air eye weapon. We had the eco-bomb, and then we had the air eye. The air eye was the development of the Italian technologists, along with the Germans and the Japanese, to find a way of observing the Earth, as it indeed is, using many spectral shots. And these are all different spectral readings of the same scene, the same locale, straight out of satellite photography. And it leads to that kind of complexity of color visions. There's one shot of, say, a desert, and there's a shot of the Sinai and a different kind of view. The first actions of the Italians were perhaps in the Sinai, and they were able to mediate the dispute between the Israelis and the Egyptians by saying, okay, we will create a new fertility site for the Palestinians, and we'll build up our marshes, and we'll build up marshes even in river basins. And there was the Sinai as it rejuvenated with new river flows coming down to the sea. It rejuvenates, as we saw before, green. Now we see a blue, a red image, an infrared image showing tremendous vegetative wealth. The Mediterranean begins to consolidate. We have the change in bird flight patterns until they get stronger and stronger, until a whole network of nutrient transfers around the whole of the Mediterranean basin, and the Mediterranean basin becomes a new state, a body state. The Navy gets into action by having the coastal waters, the estuaries, act up, then having offshore rigs thrown out into the sea, and then more offshore rigs for production of methane gas from seaweed. We have seaweed here, seaweed, and we have the rigs shipping the methane gas onto land into newfangled cities such as this. And this would be the new kind of cities in Libya, in Palestine, along the whole of the shore of the Mediterranean, earthquake-proof cities, cities furthermore fueled entirely by the sea. That would be a past vision. We have a view on how the Italians were able to do this without having to resort to imperialistic techniques, say, of the British or the French or the Russians or the Americans. Atanasio De Felice, representative of Italy.
Well, it's clear that the historical precedents in Italy's dealings with its neighboring countries in the Mediterranean is what enabled Italy to bring about the conciliation of various countries in the Mediterranean area. The Venetian tradition of trade between itself and its so-called colonies in the eastern Mediterranean, and going way back to the latter part of the Roman Empire, where the concept of Mediterranean man was conceived of as the ultimate goal of Roman economic development in the Mediterranean area. This, of course, was stopped by unfortunate invasions by barbaric tribes, but the successful implementation of Enrico Matte's oil policies over the past decade have allowed this to become an economic reality. The extension of those policies to other countries, not just Italy and let's say Libya, as was the original concept, but the extension of those policies, as in the example of Japan's pipeline to Alaska, is what is going to make the successful implementation of Matteization the key factor in the successful unification of the economic considerations in the Mediterranean area, and will provide a policy which will be exemplary for many of the world's nations to follow. Yes.
One notable event in the 1980 era was the breakup of Ethiopia, which Italy helped to instrument. Ethiopia had been trying to impose its will on the Somali and the Eritrean peoples. These peoples always revolted. And by simply area monitoring, Italy could show a Mediterranean unit, such, a rift unit in the center, including Addis Ababa, and a Somali unit over here, and an Eritrean unit up here, which meant that, in effect, a division already being politically realized could be, by air monitoring, sanctioned. And the Italians were instrumental in settling the affairs of those warring tribes. This activity in the Third World was, of course, ably furthered by such major Third World, or supposedly Third World countries as Mexico and India, the non-aligned countries, who took up the initiative in a move beyond fossil technology to biologically renewable technology. We have a report now from the Undersecretary for Rural Economics in India, Jamal Meklai.
Thank you. To start, let me say that for several years now, we in India have been aware, both conceptually and technologically, of these developments of offshore food and energy systems. But to put our views in some sort of perspective, first of all, I would like to set aside these labels of third world, developed world, developing world, and things like that. For, as is most often the case with labels, they represent at best a verbal handle with which to discuss certain issues. And too often these labels, handles if you will, get out of hand, leading to politically ineffective and economically frequently devastating alliances. Now, all countries have assets and needs, and our goal is to try to work towards matching these up. Now, as you are no doubt aware, India is a major industrial power, 10th largest in dollar value of exports, and also a vast cradle of undernourished development. Now, the events of the 70s that brought about global awareness of the limitedness of resources were unfortunately a big blow to our hopes of harnessing our industrial and technological infrastructure to fit our most pressing needs. As a result, we are today almost as impoverished as we were 10 years ago. Now, the offshore capability that you people in Italy and the Middle East have been developing are eminently well suited to our situation. You see, we have both the resources, miles of relatively undeveloped coastline on the Arabian side. Now, the Bay of Bengal side may not work too well because we have lots of cyclones, typhoons, things like that, which would not make it suitable for offshore rigs. But as I say, we have the resources in terms of the available coastline. We also have a technological infrastructure. What we are lacking is the funds to make this dream, this goal, a reality. Now, the development of the Arab Bank, which is, I understand, very close to being real. Now, this gives us a great hope. Further, India would be interested in contributing our technological know-how to the common pool as part of a package towards utilizing this new cooperative technological program. We feel that this could be a significant contribution, as there are several other needy countries who have needs as great as ours but do not have the technological infrastructure. Now, India has a long history of helping with technical input to countries in Africa, Asia, and we feel we would be in a particularly well-suited position to aid the expansion of this offshore energy, food, life system program to other countries who have great needs. Finally, in closing, I would like to convey the regards of my government to all of you. And on a personal note, I would like to thank my Japanese friend here for the wonderful gift he has given me. Thank you.
It became apparent over the years of the 1980s that although maybe Mr. Reagan or other politicians of America could attempt to pull and push the peoples of the world, indeed no one was very much impressed. The USSR and the USA became both increasingly isolated. The military policies developed by the Italians and then further developed by the Japanese and Germans and then finally, of course, the peoples of the so-called Third World were military policies for a safe bomb, an eco-bomb, that could be dropped anywhere around the world and actually develop fertility rather than reduce it, and policies for a constant surveillance that could also maintain the ocean order and land order of the world in an ecologically supportive, sustainable way. In effect, what occurred was that, as with every war, the latest technology is being developed, and the latest technology is never being realized by the generals from the last war. So the latest technology of the last World War II being aerial surveys, missiles, and certain kind of propaganda, these very techniques were implemented to the hilt by the countries that did not see much at stake for them in aligning themselves with either the USA or the USSR. So the map of the world indeed began to change from a world of 1964 of very severe Russian and American polarization to a map in 1990 of ocean order. I'm speaking really on behalf, of course, of the company that we all know has been affecting this ocean order, Ocean Earth Construction and Development Corporation, or OECD. There had been a notion at some time that the World Bank and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, a union of various so-called developed nations of the world, would be dispensing aid around the world and would be determining development policy around the world. And this OECD, or Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, was superseded during the 1980s by the OECD, a private corporation, on grounds simply that OECD had developed in Italy, in Japan, in Northern Europe, and then in Africa and throughout the so-called Third World, a policy of economic development that did not need whatsoever the powers or techniques of the multinational oil companies. They had relied, of course, on hydrocarbon engineering, but they worked on a biological basis, realizing, of course, that hydrocarbons are a result of biological processes. Space Force was one of the major trade names of OECD, and Space Force had developed the Area Monitoring System, making the map of the world today. The United States, however, had to adjust gradually, and it adjusted because of increasing decay and breakdown. Ruth here has already been pointing out some of the breakdown. Largely this was induced by the policies in the United States of the coal companies, or the oil companies, who were building up coal programs and building up a whole kind of land exploitation that simply depleted all the land and depleted all the water as well. The United States began to, in effect, fragment economically. These were scenes from the U.S. in the 1980s. Traffic jams, ill-developed architecture, fluorocarbons and hydrocarbons. The question of broken promises, a major campaign issue for Mr. Reagan, but it became really a kind of standard ongoing thing because every time Mr. Reagan tried to stop inflation, he found himself up against the oil and coal wall. And every time he tried to figure out how to market or distribute the great apparent granary wealth of the U.S. Midwest, he found that there was a declining source of nutrients in the soil. Why? Because of the standard agricultural practices. Changes in those same agricultural practices have been developed by the Italians and by the people of the Arab League back in the beginnings of the 1980s with the help of OECD. You had this kind of reliance again on fossil fuels, and of course you had the usual desert. And you had the big pipelines and apparently the big capital of Aramco and the great American consortiums with the Arabs. But that, too, was abandoned back by the mid-1980s as the Arabs here just simply said, okay, we will, with Iraqi, Assyrian, Saudi Arabian unity, break away from any attempt to rely on American capital for distribution of our wealth, and will simply consolidate in one Arab Sea basin, one Arab Sea unity. And they did so, and this then, of course, was affirmed by the Arabs over here in the northern Africa part. And then all of this became, in fact, a very wealthy area based on seas. And they exported this wealth because the Arabs had so much financial capital, and they could simply export this much better than the World Bank or any other U.S. or Western nation economic institution. The story then in the 1980s is a story of the end of the world wars, the end of the empires, and a beginning of sustainable yields. Thank you for appearing on our 1990 review of the 1980s.
Thank you.
Thank you.